Picture this, you're 7 months pregnant. Your husband just called you outdated on a red carpet while his mistress laughs beside him. Cameras are flashing. Everyone is watching your humiliation go viral in real time. You have two choices, run away crying or fight back. But here's the twist. This woman had a weapon her husband never knew existed. A secret so powerful it would destroy him in less than 10 minutes. If you want to see the most satisfying revenge story of the decade, smash that like button right now. Comment "Justice served" if you believe karma is real. And subscribe because this channel delivers the drama you crave. Let's get into it. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Claire Morrison sat in the narrow bed, cradling her newborn son against her chest. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers. So trusting, so fragile. Through the small window in the door, she could see two police officers standing guard in the hallway. Her face throbbed where the bruises bloomed purple and yellow across her cheekbone. Her ribs ached with each breath, but none of that mattered. Garrett was safe. That was all that mattered now. A nurse knocked softly before entering. "Mrs. Morrison, the detectives want to know if you're ready to give your statement." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, I'm ready to tell them everything." The nurse smiled gently. "Take your time, honey. You've been through hell." As the door closed again, Claire looked down at her sleeping son. "You're going to hear a crazy story about your mama," she whispered. "About how she was nobody, then somebody, then almost lost everything, including you. But we made it, baby. We made it through." She closed her eyes and the memories came flooding back. 72 hours earlier, she had been a different woman entirely. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse reflected Claire's image back at her. 7 months pregnant, standing in a custom black gown that cost more than her father's monthly mortgage payment. She barely recognized herself anymore. "That dress makes you look massive," Grant said from across the room, not looking up from his phone. "Try the navy one instead." Claire's hand instinctively moved to her belly. The designer said black was more elegant for the gala. "The designer works for me. Claire, everything works for me, including you." Grant finally looked at her, his expression cold. "The navy one, check?" "Now, she changed without another word. This was their routine before every public event. Grant would criticize and control until she became exactly what he wanted: silent, beautiful, and utterly compliant. They had been married for 2 years. The first 6 months had been a whirlwind of romance and champagne promises. The next 18 months had been a slow descent into this gilded prison. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Thinking of you tonight, Bella. Call me if you need anything." Grant snatched the phone from her hands. "Your hillbilly dad doesn't need updates. He should be grateful I married you in the first place." He pocketed her phone. "You've been on this too much anyway. Focus on looking presentable tonight." Claire felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Her father, Walter, lived upstate in a modest house, working as what Grant dismissively called a small-time logistics consultant. Grant had slowly cut her off from him over the past year, claiming the 3-hour drive was too inconvenient, that Walter's simple lifestyle was embarrassing. She missed her dad with an ache that never quite went away. "The car's here," Grant announced, checking his reflection one final time in the mirror. He looked perfect. As always, tall, handsome, successful. From the outside, they were Manhattan's golden couple. From the inside, Claire was drowning. As they rode in the town car toward the Plaza Hotel, Grant coached her with increasing irritation. "Don't talk to the Vanderbilt donors. You embarrass me when you discuss art. Just smile and look grateful to be there." "I used to work at a gallery," Claire said quietly. "I do know about art." "Used to," Grant emphasized. "Past tense. Now you're my wife. That's your only relevant credential." Claire turned to look out the window at the glittering Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, other women were living full lives, having careers, making their own decisions. She had traded all of that for this beautiful cage. The car pulled up to the Plaza Hotel, and suddenly they were surrounded by light. Camera flashes exploded like tiny supernovas. Reporters shouted their names from behind velvet ropes. Grant's face transformed instantly into his public smile. Warm, charming, perfect. He extended his hand back into the car, not to help her, but for the cameras. It was all performance. Claire took his hand and stepped onto the red carpet. For just a moment, surrounded by the attention and the lights, she felt a spark of her old self. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe the glamour of the evening would remind Grant of why he had loved her in the first place. Then his grip tightened painfully on her arm, his smile never wavering for the cameras. He leaned close, his lips brushing her ear as photographers captured what looked like an intimate moment between loving spouses. "Remember what I told you," he whispered, his voice like ice. "Smile, look grateful, and don't speak unless you're spoken to. Your arm candy tonight. Nothing more." The spark died as quickly as it had ignited. Claire's diamonds felt like shackles around her neck as Grant led her down the carpet toward the hotel entrance. She had no idea that in less than 2 hours, her entire world would explode. She had no idea that the man she thought was her modest father was about to change everything. And she had absolutely no idea that the biggest danger wasn't the husband beside her, but a ghost from her father's past who had been watching and waiting for 15 years. The red carpet stretched before them like a runway to hell. Claire's feet ached in her designer heels, but Grant's hand on her lower back kept her moving forward, his fingers pressing just hard enough to remind her who was in control. "Grant, over here," a photographer called out. "Give us a smile." Grant's public persona was flawless. He waved, laughed, posed with the easy confidence of a man who owned the world. Claire smiled beside him, playing her role perfectly. No one could see the desperate unhappiness behind her carefully applied makeup. They were halfway through the press gauntlet when Claire saw her. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up behind their town car, and a woman emerged in a stunning emerald gown that seemed to capture every camera flash. Brooke Sinclair. Claire recognized her from entertainment magazines, a rising actress who had just landed a major role in a summer blockbuster. She also recognized the perfume that had been clinging to Grant's suits for the past 3 months. Grant's eyes lit up when he saw Brooke. Without releasing Claire, he waved enthusiastically. "Brooke, over here." Brooke glided over with practiced grace, her smile dazzling. She positioned herself on Grant's other side, completing a triangle that placed Claire definitively as the third wheel. The cameras went insane. A reporter thrust a microphone toward them. "Grant is Dawit, you and Miss Sinclair have been spotted together quite a bit lately. What's the connection?" Grant draped his arm around Brooke's bare shoulders. Claire felt his hand to leave her back entirely. "Brooke and I are partnering on the Tribeca Tower development. She's investing her Hollywood success into real New York power. It's an exciting collaboration." "Mrs. Hartley," another reporter called out, "how do you feel about your husband's new partnership?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Grant cut her off smoothly. "Claire's taking a break from relevance to focus on motherhood. She's doing the most important job in the world." "Really?" He gestured toward Brooke with his free hand. "Meanwhile, I'm investing into the future. Can't let opportunities pass you by. Right?" The implication hung in the air like poison gas. The cameras captured it all, Grant with his arm around another woman, Claire standing alone and visibly pregnant, her face frozen in a smile that was cracking at the edges. A veteran gossip columnist named Amelia Reed pushed to the front. "That's quite a statement, and Grant, are you saying your wife is outdated?" Grant laughed, loud and dismissive. "I'm saying that success requires evolution. You can't be held back by first drafts when masterpieces are possible." He squeezed Brooke's shoulder. "Some people are content with good enough. I'm not." Claire felt something inside her shatter. This wasn't just infidelity. This was public humiliation, carefully orchestrated and executed with cruel precision. Grant was destroying her in front of hundreds of witnesses and calling it ambition. She tried to pull away, but Grant's hand shot out and gripped her arm painfully. His smile never wavered for the cameras. "Where are you going, sweetheart? The party's just starting." "I need the restroom," Claire managed, her voice barely audible. "Of course." Grant released her with a dismissive gesture. "Pregnancy hormones. You understand." This last comment was directed at the reporters, who laughed uncomfortably. Claire fled toward the hotel entrance, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall until she was out of sight. Behind her, she could hear Grant and Brooke posing for more photos, their laughter carrying on the evening air. She made it to the ladies' room and locked herself in the furthest stall. Only then did she let the tears come, silent and hot against her cheeks. That's when she heard voices at the sinks. One of them was Brooke. "You're sure he's doing it tonight?" an unfamiliar woman's voice asked. "He promised?" Brooke's voice was triumphant. "He's announcing the separation in his acceptance speech. The Entrepreneur of the Year award gives him the perfect platform. By midnight, I'll be the future Mrs. Hartley." "What about the pregnant wife?" "What about her? She's nobody. Grant said she comes from nothing. Some consultant's daughter from upstate. She should be grateful she got 2 years of the lifestyle." Brooke laughed. "Besides, once he's free of her, he'll have access to my trust fund, $20 million plus my Hollywood connections. That mousy little nobody can't compete with that." The women left, their heels clicking on the marble floor. Claire sat frozen in the stall, her hands shaking so violently she could barely pull her phone from her clutch. Except she didn't have her phone. Grant had taken it. She found a house phone in the hallway and dialed the number she knew by heart. Her father answered on the second ring. "Bella," Walter Morrison's voice was instantly alert. "What's wrong?" "Dad," Claire's voice cracked. "Can you please come get me? Something terrible has happened. Grant is leaving me, here, tonight, in front of everyone." There was a long pause. When her father spoke again, his voice had changed. It was no longer the gentle, easygoing tone she'd known her whole life. It was steel and stone and something ancient and powerful. "Stay exactly where you are, Bella. Don't move. I'm 30 minutes away." Another pause. "And Claire, there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you a long time ago. Your life is about to change in ways you can't imagine." "Dad, what are you talking about?" 30 minutes. I promise I'll explain everything. And Bella Grant Hartley has no idea who he just humiliated. No idea at all. The line went dead. Claire stood in the hallway, confused and terrified and clinging to the only hope she had left. Her father was coming. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. She had no idea that her father had been preparing for this moment since the day she'd announced her engagement to Grant Hartley. No idea that every dollar Grant had ever made came from her father's shell corporations. And no idea that Walter Morrison wasn't a small-time logistics consultant at all. He was one of the most powerful men in America. And he was about to make Grant Hartley's worst nightmare come true. Claire waited in a small, private sitting room off the plaza's main lobby. A sympathetic hotel manager had offered her the space after seeing her distress in the hallway. Through the closed door, she could hear the sounds of the gala continuing music. Laughter, the clink of champagne glasses. Her whole world was ending, and 300 people were celebrating upstairs. When the door opened, she expected a plaza employee. Instead, her father walked in. But this wasn't the Walter Morrison she knew. The man who entered wore an expensive charcoal suit that fitted him like it had been made by masters. His silver hair was perfectly styled. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. "Dad," Claire stood up uncertainly. "You look different." Walter crossed the room and pulled her into a fierce hug. "I'm sorry, Bella. I'm so sorry. I should have told you the truth years ago. I thought I was protecting you. But all I did was leave you vulnerable to a predator like Grant Hartley." "I don't understand." Claire pulled back to look at him. "What truth?" Walter guided her to the small sofa and sat beside her, taking both her hands in his. "Your mother didn't die in a random car accident." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Her mother, Sarah, had died when Claire was 13. A terrible accident. Or so she'd always been told. Faulty brakes on a winding road. "It was murder," Walter continued, his voice heavy with old pain. "A car bomb meant for me. A business rival named Roger Blackwell planted bed. Your mother was collateral damage in his revenge." Claire's mind reeled. "Why would someone want to kill you? You're a logistics consultant." "No, sweetheart, I'm not." Walter pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It displayed the Morrison Logistics corporate website. The company operated in 47 countries with annual revenue of $12 billion. "I founded Morrison Logistics 40 years ago," Walter said quietly. "I built it from a single delivery truck into one of the largest supply chain companies in the world. I'm worth approximately $8 billion. And you're my only child." Claire stared at the screen, then at her father, then back at the screen. None of this made sense. "But we lived in a normal house. I went to public school. You drove a Ford pickup truck." "I know. After your mother was killed, I made a choice. Roger Blackwell targeted Sarah to hurt me because he knew I loved her. I realized that being Walter Morrison, billionaire, made everyone I loved a target. He squeezed her hands gently. So I disappeared. I handed daily operations to Diane Porter, my CEO. I scrubbed my name from public records. I became the ghost who owned the empire. And I raised you as normally as I possibly could. Why tell me now? Claire's voice was barely a whisper. Walter's expression hardened. Because 2 years ago, when you introduced me to Grant Hartley, I did what I always do with people who get close to my family. I investigated him thoroughly. He pulled up documents on his phone. Grant Hartley's real estate empire doesn't exist. Not really. Hartley Properties is a front company funded entirely by a Morrison Logistics subsidiary called Northeast Development Ventures. Every property he owns, every deal he's made, every dollar in his accounts comes from money I control. Claire felt dizzy. You've been funding him this whole time. I set it up before you even started dating. It was a test. Bella, I wanted to see what kind of man he was when he thought he had independent wealth. Would he treat you well? Would he be honest? Would he be faithful? Walter's jaw tightened. He failed spectacularly, but you seemed happy at first, and I hoped maybe I was wrong about him. I kept waiting for you to see the truth and leave him on your own. So everything Grant has built is yours. Every single brick. Walter stood up, his presence suddenly commanding. Which means I can take it all away. Tonight, in front of everyone who matters in this city. Dad, what are you going to do? Walter checked his watch. Grant is accepting an entrepreneur award in approximately 10 minutes. According to my sources, he plans to announce your separation during his speech. He thinks he's making a power move, trading up from you to Brooke Sinclair and her Hollywood money. He looked at his daughter with fierce love. He has no idea that the woman he's about to humiliate in front of Manhattan's elite is the richest woman in New York. And he's about to find out. Claire stood on shaking legs. I don't want his money. I don't want revenge. I just want this to be over. I know, sweetheart, but this isn't just about tonight. This is about the rest of your life. Grant needs to understand that he can never touch you or your child again. The only language men like him understand is power. Walter offered her his arm. Let me do this for you. Let me be the father I should have been when you first brought him home. Claire hesitated, then took his arm. Together, they walked out of the sitting room and toward the ballroom where her husband was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. In her heart, Claire knew nothing would ever be the same again. The quiet life she'd known was over. The modest future she'd imagined was impossible now. But maybe, just maybe, she could build something better from the ashes of this disaster. She just had no idea how much more she would have to lose before that could happen. The Plaza Ballroom glittered with wealth and power. 500 of New York's elite filled the space: real estate moguls, hedge fund managers, society matrons, and politicians. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables draped in white silk. On stage, Grant Hartley stood at the podium accepting his award, a crystal sculpture symbolizing entrepreneurial excellence. He looked like he owned the world. Claire and Walter entered through a side door, unnoticed in the dimness. They stood against the back wall as Grant began his acceptance speech. Success isn't about standing still, Grant said, his voice carrying through the excellent acoustics. It's about knowing when to evolve, when to upgrade, when to leave behind what no longer serves your vision. He paused for effect, and Claire felt her stomach drop. This was it. Which is why I'm announcing tonight that my wife, Claire, and I are separating. The words landed like a pun. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Cameras flashed as photographers captured the moment. Sometimes you outgrow your first draft. Sometimes you realize that you deserve a masterpiece. Brooke Sinclair appeared from the wings and joined Grant on stage. He took her hand and kissed it while the audience murmured in shock and disapproval. This was brazen even by Manhattan standards. Grant Hartley, ladies and gentlemen, the MC said awkwardly, trying to regain control. A man who certainly knows what he wants. Grant started to leave the stage, triumphant, when a voice cut through the chaos. Not quite finished, are we? Walter Morrison walked down the center aisle, his presence commanding instant attention. Grant squinted into the crowd. Excuse me, this is a private event. I'm aware. I'm Walter Morrison. The name rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Dozens of people stood up in recognition. The CEO of J.P. Morgan, the head of BlackRock, 3 Fortune 500 CEOs. They all knew that name. The MC stammered, "Mr. Morrison, we weren't expecting you. Please come up." Walter climbed the stairs to the stage with the ease of someone who belonged there. Grant looked confused, glancing between Walter and the suddenly deferential crowd. "Morrison Parkschwein," Grant said slowly. "Wait, that's Claire's maiden name. You're her father, the consultant from upstate." "Not exactly." Walter took the microphone. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made his words even more devastating. "Good evening. For those who don't know me, I founded Morrison Logistics 40 years ago. We operate in 47 countries with annual revenue of $12 billion. I am worth approximately $8 billion. The ballroom went completely silent. This was a legend, a ghost, a man who hadn't made a public appearance in over a decade. 2 years ago, Walter continued, this man married my daughter Claire. At the time, I did what any protective father would do. I investigated his business thoroughly. Grant's face had gone from confused to pale. I discovered that Hartley Properties doesn't actually exist as an independent entity. It's a subsidiary of Northeast Development Ventures, which is itself owned by Morrison Logistics. Every property Mr. Hartley owns, every deal he's made, every dollar in his accounts comes from my company. I funded him as a test to see what kind of man my daughter had chosen. Walter's expression hardened. He failed that test tonight. He turned to Grant directly. As of this moment, Hartley Properties is dissolved. All accounts are frozen. All properties revert to Morrison ownership. Your access to Northeast Development Ventures is permanently terminated. You own nothing. Mr. Hartley, you never did. Grant lunged forward, his face twisted with rage. You can't do this. I built that company. I made those deals. Security moved to intercept him. But Walter held up a hand. You built nothing. You were a front man managing my money. And you're fired. Walter addressed the stunned audience. My daughter Claire is the sole heir to Morrison Logistics and my entire fortune. She is worth more than everyone in this room combined. He looked at Grant with cold contempt. You just publicly humiliated the richest woman in New York while she carries your child. History will not be kind to your judgment. On stage, Brooke Sinclair had backed away from Grant, her face horrified. She clearly hadn't known about any of this. Neither had anyone else. Grant's rage exploded. You bitch, he screamed toward where Claire stood at the back of the room. You knew you were using me. You let me think I was successful while you were living off Daddy's money. Claire stepped forward into the light, and the room finally saw her. Pregnant, beautiful, and radiating a dignity that Grant would never possess. I didn't know, she said clearly. My father hid his wealth to protect me. But you're right about one thing, Grant. You did use me. You used me as an accessory. A pretty thing to make you look successful. You controlled and diminished and isolated me until I barely recognized myself. She walked down the aisle toward the stage, her head held high. But I'm done being your accessory. I'm done being anyone's first draft. You want to trade up? Go ahead, I'm trading away. The audience erupted in applause. Not polite society applause, but genuine, thunderous support. The women especially were on their feet. Grant stood frozen, his world crumbling around him. 2 police officers entered from a side door. Mr. Hartley, we have a warrant for your arrest. Securities fraud and falsifying business documents. Your forensic audit started 30 minutes ago, Walter said quietly as the officers approached Grant. My lawyers are extraordinarily efficient. As Grant was led away in handcuffs, still screaming about injustice, Brooke Sinclair slipped off stage and disappeared into the crowd. She wanted no part of this disaster. Claire climbed the stage stairs and stood beside her father. The 500 most powerful people in New York City looked at her with new eyes, respect, curiosity, and more than a little fear. I didn't want this, Claire said softly to her father. I know, Walter replied, but you're stronger than you realize, Bella, and you're going to do amazing things with the life you build next. In that moment, Claire believed him. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like herself again. Not Grant's wife, not a decoration or an accessory, just Claire Morrison, about to become a mother and figure out who she really was. She had no idea that her real test was still 6 months away, that a ghost from her father's past was already watching and planning his revenge, that the man who killed her mother was about to return and turn her newfound strength into her greatest nightmare. But for tonight, she had won, and that was enough. 6 months had passed since the gala. Claire stood in the nursery she'd designed in her father's Connecticut estate, holding her 6-week-old son Garrett. Through the window, she could see acres of rolling green hills and the distant line of white fencing that marked the horse pastures. "He has your mother's eyes," Walter said from the doorway. He'd aged in reverse since Claire came home. The burden of secrecy finally lifted. "I wish she could have met him," Claire said softly. "She would have loved him, and she would be so proud of you." Claire had spent the past months healing and learning. While her body recovered from childbirth, her mind devoured everything about Morrison Logistics: financial statements, operational reports, market analyses. She attended board meetings remotely, sitting in the back and observing. She watched Diane Porter run the company with precision and intelligence. Diane was in her mid-40s, sharp as broken glass, and had been Walter's right hand for 15 years. At first, Claire expected resentment. Instead, Diane had become her mentor. "Your father built this company through ruthlessness," Diane had told her during their first private meeting. "He had to. It was a different era. But you, Claire, you can transform it into something better. Something that makes money and makes a difference." Now, 3 months later, Claire was preparing for her first major presentation to the board. She'd been named Chief Sustainability Officer, a newly created position that would allow her to reshape the company's environmental and social impact. "They're going to push back," Diane warned as they reviewed Claire's proposal in the estate study. "Sustainability costs money up front. The old guard won't like it." "Then we show them the long-term ROI," Claire said, pulling up market data. "Companies with strong ESG ratings outperform their peers by an average of 18%. Millennials and Gen Z consumers demand ethical business practices. We're not changing to be nice. We're changing to dominate the next 30 years. Diane smiled. "You're your father's daughter, after all." The board meeting took place in Morrison Logistics' Manhattan headquarters, a gleaming tower in Midtown. Claire walked into the conference room holding her binder of research, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. 12 board members watched her with varying degrees of skepticism. She recognized most of them from her father's stories. Theodore Banks, who'd been with Morrison since the beginning. Margaret Sterling, a logistics genius who'd revolutionized their European operations. James Keller, the CFO who worried about every dollar. "Members of the board," Claire began, "I'm proposing a 5-year transformation plan that will position Morrison Logistics as the global leader in sustainable supply chain management." She walked them through carbon-neutral shipping, ethical labor practices, renewable energy investments, and circular economy partnerships. With each slide, she addressed their concerns before they could voice them. Cost. Here's the ROI projection. Competitive disadvantage. Here's how it becomes our moat. Regulatory risk. Here's how we get ahead of legislation. By the end of her presentation, the skeptics were leaning forward. Theodore Banks was the first to speak. "This is bold, Claire, but risky, but I'll be damned if it isn't brilliant." The vote was unanimous. Project Phoenix, named for rebirth from ashes, was approved with a $700 million initial investment. As the board members filed out, congratulating her, Claire felt a presence beside her. Marcus Reed, the head of Morrison's security team, had been standing quietly in the corner throughout the meeting. "You did well," Marcus said. He was ex-military, 40s, with kind eyes that missed nothing. He'd been protecting Claire since the night of the gala, a silent shadow who made her feel safe. "Thanks for being here," Claire said. "I know board meetings are not exactly your area. Wherever you are is my area." He said it matter-of-factly, professionally, but there was something in his voice that made Claire's heart skip. Over the following months, Marcus was always there. When she worked late, he brought her coffee. When she traveled to visit Morrison facilities, he coordinated security. When Garrett woke crying at 3 in the morning, sometimes Marcus would already be downstairs, having heard the baby monitor he'd installed throughout the estate. "You don't have to do this." Claire told him one evening. They were in the kitchen, and Marcus was warming a bottle while Claire tried to soothe a fussy Garrett. "I know," Marcus said, "but I want to." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air felt charged with possibility. Then Garrett burped spectacularly, breaking the tension, and they both laughed. 1 year after the gala, Morrison Logistics launched Project Phoenix publicly. The press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Claire appeared on the cover of Forbes' The Reluctant Heiress Reimagining Capitalism. Inside, the article detailed her transformation of Morrison Logistics into a model of ethical business. The stock price had initially dipped when the $700 million investment was announced. Now it was up 40% as investors recognized the long-term strategy. Claire had also established the Sarah Morrison Foundation, named for her mother. It provided resources for domestic violence survivors, helping them escape abuse and rebuild their lives. The foundation's first center opened in Manhattan, serving hundreds of women in its first months. "Your mother would be so proud," Walter told her at the opening ceremony. Garrett, now 8 months old, sat on his grandfather's lap, grabbing at his tie. "I hope so," Claire said. She looked around at the women they were helping. Women who reminded her of who she'd been just a year ago, trapped, scared, unsure if they deserved better. "I want her memory to mean something." That night, back at the estate, Claire stood on the terrace looking at the stars. Marcus found her there, as he often did. "Penny, for your thoughts," he asked. "I'm happy," Claire said, "huh," and realized it was true. "For the first time in years, I'm genuinely happy. I have my son. I have my father back. I have meaningful work. I have you." She blushed slightly. I have your friendship, which I value." Marcus smiled. "I value your friendship too, Claire, more than you know." He pulled a small box from his pocket. "I was waiting for the right moment. I think this might be it." Claire's breath caught. Inside the box was a simple, elegant ring. "I'm not good with speeches," Marcus said, "but I love you. I love Garrett. I want to build a life with you. If you'll have me." Claire kissed him before she could answer with words. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "Yes, absolutely yes." It felt like a fairy tale ending. Claire had escaped her abuser, inherited an empire, transformed it into something meaningful, and found real love. She was safe. Garrett was safe. Her future stretched ahead, bright with possibility. She had no idea that her fairy tale was about to become a nightmare. That 200 miles away, a man who'd been released from prison 18 months ago had spent every day planning his revenge. That Roger Blackwell had been watching and waiting, and now he was finally ready to strike. The happiest moment of Claire's new life was about to become the beginning of her worst fear. 3 months after Marcus proposed, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything changed. Claire was in her office at Morrison headquarters, reviewing quarterly reports while Garrett napped in the adjacent playroom they'd set up. She'd become comfortable balancing motherhood and leadership, bringing Garrett to work several days a week. A courier arrived with an unmarked package. Claire's assistant signed for it and brought it to her desk. "This just came for you, no return address." Claire opened the padded envelope, expecting business documents. Instead, she found photographs, dozens of them. Her blood turned to ice. They were pictures of Garrett at his daycare, close-up shots taken with a telephoto lens. Garrett on the playground, Garrett at nap time, Garrett being picked up by Claire's nanny. Someone had been watching her son for weeks, maybe months. Beneath the photos was a note constructed from the cut-out magazine letters, like something from a horror movie. "You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you, starting with what you love most." Well, Claire's hand shook so violently she dropped the photos. She hit the panic button on her desk, and within seconds, Marcus burst through the door, weapon drawn. "Claire, hey, what happened?" She couldn't speak. She just pointed at the photographs scattered across her desk. Marcus's face went hard. He grabbed his radio. "Code Black, initiate full lockdown. Get Ms. Morrison and the baby to the safe room. Move now." Within minutes, Claire and Garrett were in a reinforced room 3 floors below ground level. Walter arrived shortly after, having been helicoptered in from Connecticut. Diane Porter came too, her usual composure shaken. "Who would do this?" Diane asked. Walter stared at the photographs Marcus had secured as evidence. His face had gone gray. I know exactly who did this. He looked at Claire, and she saw something in her father's eyes she'd never seen before: fear. Real, visceral fear. His name is Roger Blackwell, Walter said quietly. He was my business partner 40 years ago. When I discovered he was embezzling, I moved to force him out of the company. That same week, his wife divorced him and took their 2 children. Roger blamed me for destroying his family. The car bomb, Claire whispered. The one that killed Mom. It was meant for me. Roger planted it under my car. Your mother took my car that day because hers was in the shop. Walter's voice cracked. She died because Roger Blackwell wanted revenge. You said he went to prison. 8 years for embezzlement. I had evidence for the murder, but not enough for a conviction. Roger was released 18 months ago. I had people watching him. He was living in Queens, working construction. Then 6 months ago, he vanished. My team lost track of him. Walter looked at the photos again. Now I know why. Marcus pulled up records on his tablet. Little Lamb's Daycare hired a maintenance worker 6 months ago. David Black. Background check came back clean. David Black, Claire repeated slowly. D. Black. Blackwell. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Roger Blackwell had been near Garrett every single day for 6 months, watching him, waiting. We pulled Garrett from daycare immediately, Marcus said. I'll personally vet every single person who comes near him. It's too late for that, Walter said. Roger didn't send these photos as a prelude. He sent them as an announcement. He's ready to make his move. As if summoned by those words, Claire's phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at Marcus, who nodded and started recording. Claire answered on speaker. Hello? Hello, Claire? The voice was male, older, cultured. You don't know me, but I knew your mother, briefly. Right before she died, Claire's throat closed with terror. My name is Roger Blackwell. Your father took everything from me. My company, my wife, my children. 15 years I've been waiting to return the favor. A pause. That's a beautiful boy you have. Looks just like his grandfather. Doesn't he? If you touch him, I'll destroy you. Claire managed. Roger laughed. With what daddy's money, daddy's power. That's all you are, Claire, a little girl playing pretend with resources you didn't earn. But don't worry, soon you'll understand what it really means to lose everything. The line went dead. Claire looked at her father, at Marcus, at Diane. What do? We wait, Walter said grimly. And we prepare, because Roger Blackwell doesn't make empty threats. That night, back at the Connecticut estate, Claire couldn't sleep. She stood in Garrett's nursery, watching him sleep peacefully in his crib. He had no idea that a monster was circling their lives. Marcus found her there at 2 a.m. You should rest. How can I? Claire turned to him, tears streaming down her face. Someone wants to hurt my baby because of choices my father made 40 years ago. Garrett is innocent. How is that fair? Marcus pulled her into his arms. It's not fair. None of this is fair. But we're going to protect him. I promise you. Claire, I will not let anyone hurt your son. She wanted to believe him, but as she looked down at Garrett's sleeping face, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. And she was right. Because 3 days later, Roger Blackwell would make his move. And by the time the sun set, Claire would have lost everything she'd spent the past year building. The fairy tale was over. The nightmare was just beginning. For 3 days, they lived in a state of siege. Morrison Estate's security was tripled. Every visitor was vetted. Garrett never left Claire's sight. Marcus coordinated with the FBI, though Roger Blackwell had committed no prosecutable crime yet. Threatening photos weren't enough for an arrest. On Friday afternoon, Claire was in a video conference with the Morrison Logistics Board when Marcus entered her home office, his face grim. Excuse me a moment, Claire said, muting her microphone. What is it? We have a problem. David Foster, one of our junior security guards, didn't show up for his shift this morning. We checked his apartment. Empty. Cleaned out overnight. Claire's stomach dropped. How long has he been on staff? 8 months. Marcus pulled up Foster's file. His background check was clean, references solid, but I just got off the phone with his previous employer. They never heard of him. The references were fake. Roger's nephew, Claire whispered. Probably, which means Roger knows everything. Floor plans, security protocols, camera positions, every vulnerability we have. The lights went out, not just in the office, but throughout the entire estate. The backup generators should have kicked in immediately. They didn't. Marcus's radio crackled. All units, we have a total power failure. Generators are not responding. Repeat, generators are not responding. Then Claire's phone lit up in the darkness. A text from an unknown number. It was a photo Garrett sleeping in his crib, taken from above. The timestamp read, 2 minutes ago. Below the photo, East Stables. Alone home. You and Walter. 10 minutes or I start cutting. Claire's scream brought her father running. Walter took one look at the photo and went pale. He's already inside. God help us. He's been inside the whole time. Marcus was already moving. Teams to the nursery now. Secure the baby. But when they reached Garrett's room, it was empty. The window was open, curtains billowing. On the crib was a baby blanket and another note. 8 minutes left. Claire nearly collapsed. Marcus caught her. We'll get him back. I promise. The East Stables, Walter said. That's where Roger and I used to meet when we were partners, before everything went wrong. He's making a point. The East Stables had been converted into a luxury guest house years ago. It sat on the far end of the property, deliberately isolated for privacy. As Claire and Walter approached with Marcus and his team shadowing them from a distance, they could see candlelight flickering in the windows. The door was unlocked. Inside, sitting in a leather armchair with Garrett sleeping peacefully in his arms, was Roger Blackwell. He was in his late 50s, gray-haired, gaunt. His eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd lost everything and had nothing left to fear. And strapped to his chest was a vest packed with what looked like explosives. Hello, Walter, Roger said calmly. It's been a long time. Let the baby go, Roger. Walter's voice was steady despite the terror in his eyes. Your fight is with me, not an innocent child. Innocent? Roger laughed bitterly. There's no such thing as innocent in the Morrison family. You taught me that when you stole my company and my family, you were embezzling millions, Walter said. I had documentation. You forced my hand. I took what I was owed. I built that company as much as you did. Roger's grip on Garrett tightened slightly. The baby stirred, but didn't wake. And for that, you destroyed me. My wife left. My children won't speak to me. I spent 8 years in prison. And your punishment, you got to disappear into luxury with your perfect daughter. Claire stepped forward. You killed my mother. That was an accident, Roger said, but there was no remorse in his voice. The bomb was meant for your father. Collateral damage happens in war. Just like my family was collateral damage to his ambition. He gestured to the vest. This is a dead man's switch. My thumb leaves this button. We all die. The baby. You. Me. Everyone within 50 feet. I've been planning this for 18 months. I'm not leaving anything to chance. Walter moved slowly toward a desk. What do you want? Roger, I want you to sign over Morrison Logistics to me. Complete transfer of ownership. You built an empire on my back. Walter, it should have been mine. So now it will be. He pulled out legal documents, clearly prepared by a lawyer. Sign it, right now, or I release this switch and take your grandson with me. Claire looked at Marcus, who was visible in the doorway, his sniper rifle trained on Roger. But the angle was wrong. Any shot risked hitting Garrett or detonating the explosives. Take it, Claire said. Dad, sign it. Please. I don't care about the money. Just give me my son back. No. Roger shook his head. It's not that simple. Claire, I don't just want the company. I want him to suffer like I suffered. I want him to watch everything he loves disappear. Then why the documents? Walter asked. Because I want it to be legal. I want you to voluntarily give me everything before I take your grandson anyway. Roger smiled, and it was the smile of madness. I've been planning this suicide for months, was just waiting for the right moment, the right audience. Now I have it. His thumb moved fractionally toward releasing the switch. That's when Emily Ashford stepped out from behind the curtains. Claire had no idea how the investigative journalist had gotten there, but she was holding a video camera, and she'd been recording everything. "Roger Blackwell," Emily said clearly. "You just confessed to murdering Sarah Morrison on tape. This footage is being live-streamed to the FBI right now." Roger's eyes widened. For just a second, his concentration broke. That second was all Marcus needed. The tranquilizer dart hit Roger in the neck, a perfect shot that avoided the baby entirely. Roger's eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, but his hand stayed clenched around the dead man's switch. The next 10 seconds felt like hours. Marcus was there instantly, carefully taking Garrett from Roger's unconscious arms. Claire sobbed as her son was placed in her hands, alive and unhurt. A bomb squad member in full protective gear approached Roger's still-breathing body. "The switch is still engaged. If his hand relaxes, we're done." "His heart rate is stable at the bedside," another technician said, monitoring Roger's vitals. "The tranquilizer won't kill him. His unconscious muscle tension should hold the switch for at least 15 minutes. That's our window." With agonizing precision, the bomb tech worked to remove the vest. Claire watched from outside, holding Garrett tight, Marcus's arms around them both. Walter stood beside them, visibly shaking. After 12 minutes that aged them all by years, the bomb tech emerged carrying the disarmed vest. "We're clear. The device is neutralized." Roger Blackwell woke up 30 minutes later in restraints, surrounded by FBI agents. Emily Ashford's footage showed him confessing to murder and terrorism. Between her recording and the physical evidence, Roger would never see freedom again. As he was loaded into an FBI transport vehicle, Roger looked at Claire through the window. His last words, muffled by the glass, "You'll never be safe. Someone will always want what you have." Walter put his arm around his daughter. "Then we'll be ready. Because unlike him, we don't destroy our family for revenge. We protect each other." That night, Claire held Garrett in her arms and cried tears of relief and residual terror. They had survived. They had won. But the cost had been enormous. Claire knew she'd never feel truly safe again. Every stranger would be a potential threat. Every unknown package a possible danger. This was the price of wealth and power. And it was a price she'd have to find a way to live with. For Garrett's sake, for her father's sake, and for her own. The weeks following Roger Blackwell's arrest were a blur of FBI interviews, therapy sessions, and sleepless nights. Claire found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, her body unable to forget the terror of those moments in the East Stables. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the trauma specialist Walter had hired, sat across from Claire in the estate's sunroom. "What you're experiencing is completely normal. You went through a life-threatening event. Your nervous system is still processing that. I can't even take Garrett to the park without having a panic attack," Claire said, her voice breaking. "Every person I see, I wonder if they're a threat. Marcus has to check every room before I'll enter it. This isn't living. This is just surviving. Healing isn't linear," Dr. Hayes said gently. "You're not going to wake up one day magically over this. But you will heal, one day at a time." Marcus had become not just her protector, but her anchor. At night, when Claire woke screaming from nightmares of losing Garrett, Marcus was there. He never told her to get over it or move on. He just held her until the panic subsided. "I'm supposed to be strong," Claire told him one night after a particularly bad episode. "I run a billion-dollar company. I'm supposed to have it together." "Strength isn't pretending you're not scared," Marcus said. "Strength is being terrified and choosing to keep going anyway. That's what you do every single day." Walter struggled with his own guilt. One evening, Claire found him in his study, staring at an old photo of Sarah. "I should have killed him," Walter said quietly. "When I had the chance 15 years ago, I should have made sure Roger could never hurt anyone I loved again." "Dad, no," Claire sat beside him. "That's not who you are, and it's not who I want you to be. He almost killed my grandson because I showed him mercy." "He almost killed your grandson because he was a broken, vengeful man who couldn't let go of the past. That's on him, not you." Claire took her father's hand. "You taught me that revenge doesn't fix anything. It just creates more pain. Roger's in prison for life now. It's over." "Is it?" Walter looked at her. He said someone will always want what we have. Maybe, but we're still here. We're still together, and I refuse to let him steal any more of our lives. It was Claire who suggested they needed to do something positive, something that would turn their trauma into purpose. She called a meeting with Diane Porter and the Morrison Foundation board. I want to expand the foundation, Claire said. Not just domestic violence survivors. I want to help children who've been affected by violence. Kids who've lost parents. Kids who've witnessed trauma. I want to create a place where they can heal. Diane smiled. Your mother would love that. The Sarah Morrison Center for Children, Claire said, with therapy, education support, mentorship programs, everything a child needs to break the cycle of violence and build a better future. The board approved a $100 million initial investment. Claire threw herself into the project with fierce determination. If she couldn't change what had happened to her, she could at least help others who'd been through similar pain. 3 months after the attack, Claire returned to Morrison Logistics headquarters for the first time. The employees gave her a standing ovation when she entered the building. She'd become more than just the boss's daughter or the CEO in training. She was a survivor who'd faced down evil and won. In her first board meeting back, Claire presented a new initiative, trauma-informed workplace policies, flexible schedules for employees dealing with mental health issues, comprehensive therapy coverage, mandatory training for managers on recognizing and supporting staff in crisis. Some of you might think this is too soft, Claire said. That business is business, and personal problems should stay personal. But I've learned something these past months. We're not just running a company. We're responsible for thousands of families. When we take care of our people, they take care of our business. It's that simple. Theodore Banks nodded. Motion to approve. Let's make Morrison Logistics the most humane company in America. The vote was unanimous. That evening, Claire stood in Garrett's nursery, watching him play with his blocks. He was almost 2 now, too young to remember the attack. She wanted to keep it that way. Marcus appeared in the doorway. How are you feeling? Better, Claire said, and it was true. I'm not healed yet. Maybe I never will be completely. But I'm learning to live with what happened instead of being controlled by it. You're the strongest person I know, Marcus said. Claire smiled. I'm getting married to the second strongest person I know. That helps. They'd set a wedding date for the following spring. Small ceremony. Just family and close friends. Claire didn't need a spectacle. She just needed Marcus, her father, her son, and the promise of building something real together. As winter turned to spring, Claire found herself thinking less about Roger Blackwell and more about the future. The Sarah Morrison Center for Children broke ground in March. Morrison Logistics was thriving under Project Phoenix, and Claire had been officially named CEO designate, set to take over from Diane Porter within 2 years. Your mother would be so proud, and Walter told her at the groundbreaking ceremony. Not because of the money or the power, but because you're using all of it to make the world better. Claire hugged her father tightly. I learned from the best. She'd been through hell and back. She'd been humiliated, terrorized, and pushed to her breaking point. But she'd survived. And more than that, she'd transformed her pain into purpose. The scared woman who'd fled that red carpet 2 years ago felt like a different person now. Claire had discovered a strength she never knew she had, not the kind that came from wealth or position, but the kind that came from choosing to keep going when everything told you to give up. And she was just getting started. The wedding took place on a perfect May morning at the Morrison estate. The ceremony was held in the Rose Garden, with only 50 guests, family, close friends, and the people who'd stood by Claire through everything. Garrett, now 2.5, served as ring bearer with varying degrees of success. He made it halfway down the aisle before abandoning his duties to chase a butterfly. The guests laughed, and Claire felt her heart swell with joy. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Claire looked at Marcus waiting for her under the flower-covered arbor. This man had protected her, believed in her, and loved her through her darkest moments. He'd never asked her to be anything other than herself. Who gives this woman in marriage? The officiant asked. I do, Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. With all my love and blessing. He kissed Claire's cheek and whispered, your mother would love him. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When they exchanged vows, Claire spoke from her heart. 2 years ago, I didn't know who I was. I'd lost myself trying to be what someone else wanted. You helped me find myself again. Marcus, not by fixing me or saving me, but by loving me while I learned to save myself. I promise to be your partner, your equal, your best friend, for all my days. Marcus's vows were equally moving. You're the bravest person I've ever known, Claire. Watching you transform pain into purpose has been the honor of my life. I promise to protect you and Garrett with everything I am, to support your dreams, and to remind you, on the hard days, just how strong you really are. When the officiant pronounced them married, the garden erupted in applause. Claire kissed her husband, and for the first time in years, she felt complete. The reception was a celebration of survival and new beginnings. Emily Ashford, who'd become a close friend, gave a toast. I've covered a lot of stories in my career, but Claire Morrison's story is the one I'll never forget. She shows us that our worst moments don't define us. How we rise from them does. Diane Porter raised her glass to the future CEO of Morrison Logistics, the woman who's proving that ethical business isn't just possible, it's profitable. And to the friend who taught me that it's never too late to put people before profits. Walter's toast was the one that made everyone cry. My daughter has taught me something these past 2 years. I spent decades hiding in the shadows, thinking I was protecting her. But she didn't need protecting. She needed the freedom to become who she was meant to be. Claire Isfay Ovid transformed our family legacy from one of power and control to one of compassion and courage. Your mother would be so proud. I know I am. As the sun set over the Connecticut hills, Claire danced with her new husband, her son sleeping peacefully in her father's arms nearby. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation on the red carpet had felt like the end of her world, but it had been the beginning of her real life, the life where she got to choose who she wanted to be. 6 months after the wedding, the Sarah Morrison Center for Children officially opened. The 5-story building in downtown Manhattan was designed to feel warm and safe, not institutional. Art therapy rooms, libraries, playgrounds, everything a traumatized child might need to begin healing. At the dedication ceremony, Claire shared the stage with 3 young people. The foundation had helped a teenager whose father had gone to prison for domestic violence, a college student who'd lost her mother to a hate crime, and a young boy who'd witnessed his sister's death in a school shooting. These 3 young people represent hundreds more. We're already helping, Claire said. They show us that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. With support, with resources, with people who believe in them, survivors can become thrivers. They can transform their pain into power. The teenage girl approached the microphone. Ms. Morrison came to visit our center last month. She told me her story, how she'd escaped abuse and rebuilt her life. She told me something I'll never forget. You're not broken. You're breaking free. That's what this place does. It helps us break free. Claire wiped tears from her eyes as the audience stood in applause. That evening, at home with Marcus and Garrett, Claire reflected on how far she'd come. Morrison Logistics was now the top-rated company in their industry for workplace culture and sustainability practices. Stock prices had doubled under the new ethical business model. Competitors were copying their approach. The Sarah Morrison Foundation had expanded to 3 cities, helping thousands of survivors annually. Claire was in talks to expand nationally within 5 years. And personally, she'd built a life filled with genuine love and purpose. Marcus was her true partner, supporting her ambitions while pursuing his own consulting work with other companies on security and crisis management. Garrett was thriving, a happy, confident child who knew he was loved. What are you thinking about? Marcus asked. Finding her on the terrace. How strange life is, Claire said. 2.5 years ago, I was so lost. I thought I needed Grant to have value. I thought I was nothing without someone telling me I was something. And now I know my value doesn't come from anyone else's opinion, not Grant's, not even my father's. It comes from the choices I make every day, to use my resources to help others, to raise my son with love instead of control, to build businesses that lift people up instead of crushing them. Marcus put his arm around her. You've changed a lot of lives, Claire. I've changed my own life, she corrected. Everything else flows from that. As they stood together watching the sunset, Claire felt profound gratitude. Not for the money or the power, though those were tools she could use for good, but for the freedom to become herself, the courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless, and the wisdom to understand that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up every single time and choosing to build something better from the wreckage. Grant Hartley was serving the final months of his prison sentence, largely forgotten by the world that had once celebrated him. Brooke Sinclair had faded into obscurity after her association with his fraud. Roger Blackwell would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, his legacy one of bitterness and violence. But Claire's legacy was just beginning, and it would be one of transformation, compassion, and the unshakable belief that even the most broken lives could be rebuilt into something beautiful. 5 years after the red carpet incident, Claire Morrison stood at a podium in the United Nations General Assembly Hall. She'd been invited to speak about ethical business practices and corporate responsibility. Looking out at the representatives from 193 countries, Claire thought about the terrified woman who'd fled the Plaza Hotel that night. She almost couldn't recognize her anymore. "I'm not here to tell you a fairy tale about business," Claire began. "I'm here to tell you what I learned from my worst moments. 5 years ago, I was publicly humiliated by my husband on a red carpet. I learned I'd been living a lie, that the man I trusted had been controlling and diminishing me for years." The audience was silent, listening intently. That same night, I discovered my father was a billionaire who'd hidden his wealth my entire life. Suddenly, I went from being nobody to being one of the richest women in America. You might think that solved all my problems. It didn't. It created new ones. Claire shared her story, the terror of Roger Blackwell's attack, the trauma of almost losing her son, the long road to healing. But she also shared what she'd built from that pain. Morrison Logistics is now valued at $15 billion, 30% more than when I started leading its transformation 5 years ago. We're also the highest rated company in our industry for employee satisfaction, environmental sustainability, and community impact. These things aren't contradictory. They're connected. She clicked to her next slide, showing Morrison's growth metrics alongside their social impact numbers. When you treat people with dignity, they do better work. When you invest in sustainable practices, you reduce long-term costs and attract conscious consumers. When you give back to communities, you build loyalty that no advertising can buy. Ethical business isn't charity, it's strategy. After her speech, Claire was surrounded by business leaders and government officials wanting to learn more. She spent hours answering questions, sharing frameworks, and encouraging others to see that profit and purpose didn't have to be enemies. That evening, back in her hotel room, she video called home. Marcus appeared on screen with Garrett, now 7 years old. "Mommy, when are you coming home?" Garrett asked. "Grandpa said we could go riding tomorrow if you're back. I'll be home tomorrow afternoon." "Sweetheart, save a horse for me." After Garrett ran off to play, Marcus lingered on the call. "How did it go?" "Good, really good. I think we're finally reaching a tipping point where enough business leaders are willing to try something different. You're changing the world." "Claire," she smiled. "I'm trying. One company, one foundation, one person at a time." The next morning, before her flight home, Claire made an unannounced visit to a women's shelter in Manhattan. She'd been supporting it quietly for years, but the director didn't know about her connection to the Morrison Foundation. In the common room, she met a young woman named Lisa who'd recently escaped an abusive relationship. Lisa was in her late 20s, pregnant, scared, and trying to figure out how to rebuild her life. "I don't know how I'm going to do this," Lisa said, tears streaming down her face. "I have no money, no job, no family support. I feel so stupid for staying with him as long as I did." Claire sat beside her, taking her hand. "You're not stupid. You're brave. Do you know how much courage it takes to leave? Most people never do. But I have nothing now. You have yourself, and that's more than you realize." Claire pulled out her phone and showed Lisa photos of the Sarah Morrison Center. "This is a place my foundation runs. We help survivors like you, job training, therapy, childcare, housing assistance, everything you need to build a new life. Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Because 5 years ago, I was you, Different circumstances, but the same fear, the same feeling of being trapped and worthless. Someone helped me remember who I was. Now I help others do the same. She gave Lisa her card, not as CEO of Morrison Logistics, but as founder of the Sarah Morrison Foundation. Call this number tomorrow. Ask for Janet. Tell her Claire sent you. They'll take care of everything. On the flight home, Claire reflected on how far she'd come. She was now CEO of Morrison Logistics, having officially taken over from Diane Porter a year ago. Under her leadership, the company had become a model for conscious capitalism, proving that businesses could thrive while doing good. The Sarah Morrison Foundation now operated in 12 cities, helping over 50,000 people annually. They'd expanded beyond domestic violence to support all survivors of trauma, veterans with PTSD, refugees, victims of hate crimes, anyone struggling to rebuild after life-altering trauma. Claire had also become a sought-after speaker and advisor, helping other companies transform their business practices. She'd written a book, Rising from the Ashes, Building Purpose from Pain. That had become a bestseller and was being taught in business schools around the world. But more than any of that, she was happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way she'd never been during her marriage to Grant. Her relationship with Marcus was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine partnership. They made decisions together. They supported each other's dreams. They raised Garrett with love and honesty, teaching him that real strength meant being kind, that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege, and that his worth as a person had nothing to do with money or status. Walter, now 70, had fully embraced his role as grandfather and chairman emeritus of Morrison Logistics. He spent his days on the estate, riding horses, playing with Garrett, and quietly funding causes he believed in. The burden of secrecy he'd carried for decades was gone, and he'd aged backwards because of it. "I wasted so many years hiding," he told Claire one evening. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was just afraid. You taught me that the only way to really live is to be fully yourself, consequences and all." On the 5-year anniversary of the red carpet incident, Claire organized a private gathering at the estate. Just family and the core group who'd been with her through everything: Marcus, Walter, Diane, Emily, and the key staff from the foundation. "I want to thank you all," Claire said, raising her glass. 5 years ago tonight, my life fell apart in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. I thought it was the end of everything, but it was actually the beginning." She looked around at the faces of the people who'd supported her transformation. "You helped me understand that I wasn't broken, I was breaking free, and that made all the difference." Diane stood up. "I think we should acknowledge what Claire's accomplished. 5 years ago, Morrison Logistics was a traditional company focused purely on profit. Today, we're industry leaders in ethical business. Our employee retention is 94%, the highest in our sector. Our carbon emissions are down 60%, and our profits are up 30%. Claire didn't just transform the company, she transformed the entire industry," Emily added. "And the social impact. The Sarah Morrison Foundation has helped 50,000 people rebuild their lives, 50,000 families who have hope because Claire refused to let her trauma define her." Walter's voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "My daughter has done what I could never do. I built an empire through ruthlessness and secrecy. She's building a legacy through compassion and courage. She's everything her mother was and more. I couldn't be prouder." That night, after everyone had left, Claire stood in the rose garden where she'd married Marcus, the same spot where she'd promised to be his partner and equal. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation on the red carpet had stripped away everything she thought she was. In that moment of complete vulnerability, she'd been forced to discover who she actually was beneath all the external validation. She'd learned that strength wasn't about never being broken. It was about how you put yourself back together afterward. She'd learned that wealth was a tool, not an identity. That power without purpose was meaningless. That the only legacy worth building was one that made the world better for others. Most importantly, she'd learned that she did not need anyone to complete her or validate her. She was enough, all by herself. Everything else, the love, the partnership, the family, those were additions to an already whole person, not missing pieces she needed to function. Marcus found her in the garden, as he always did. "What are you thinking about?" "How grateful I am. Not for what I have, though I'm grateful for that too, but for what I survived, for what I learned in Washington, for who I became because of it. Any regrets? Claire considered the question seriously. I regret the pain. I regret that Garrett will grow up knowing his biological father is in prison for fraud. I regret that my mother never got to meet her grandson. But do I regret the journey? No, because it led me here to this life, to this person I've become. She turned to face her husband. That scared woman on the red carpet 5 years ago. She's still part of me. She always will be. But she's not all of me anymore. Not even close. Who are you now? Marcus asked. Claire smiled. I'm a mother, a wife, a CEO, a survivor, a fighter. Someone who knows that the worst day of your life doesn't have to define you. It can refine you if you let it. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Claire looked up at the stars and sent a silent thank you to her mother. She'd built a legacy that honored Sarah's memory while creating something entirely her own. The story that had started with humiliation and ended in triumph wasn't really about revenge or justice or even success. It was about transformation, about a woman who discovered that her value didn't come from her husband's approval, her father's money, or the world's opinion. It came from her choices, from her courage, from her commitment to building something meaningful from the broken pieces of her old life. Claire Morrison had been nobody pretending to be somebody. Then she'd been somebody pretending to be nobody. Now, finally, she was just herself, flawed, strong, compassionate, fierce, a survivor who'd become a thriver, a victim who'd become a victor. And her story was far from over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Claire woke early and went to Garrett's room. Her son was still sleeping, his face peaceful and innocent. She thought about the world he would inherit, the one she was working so hard to improve. I promise you, she whispered. You'll grow up knowing that your worth isn't tied to what you own or who your family is. You'll know that real power comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. And you'll know that no matter what happens, you're loved for exactly who you are. Garrett stirred and opened his eyes. Morning, Mama. Morning, sweetheart. Ready for a new day. He nodded enthusiastically. Can we go see Grandpa's horses? Absolutely. As they walked hand in hand toward the stables, the morning sun breaking over the Connecticut hills, Claire felt complete peace. She'd been humiliated on a red carpet 5 years ago, her dignity shattered in front of the world, but she'd rebuilt herself into something stronger, kinder, and more purposeful than she'd ever been. She'd transformed her father's empire. She'd created a foundation that changed thousands of lives. She'd raised a Tipan who would understand that privilege was responsibility. Most importantly, she'd learned the most valuable lesson of all. You are not what happens to you. You are what you choose to become afterward. And Claire Morrison had chosen to become extraordinary.